Garrett Montgomery believed he owned the world. He had the penthouse, the private jet, and a wife who was the perfect, elegant accessory to his gilded life. But perfection wasn't enough. In the hushed corner of a Michelin-starred restaurant, he committed the ultimate betrayal, sliding a legendary diamond ring onto the finger of his mistress, a ring with a history as deep and dark as the secrets he kept. He thought it was just another asset, he was moving another conquest. He had no idea that the silent, graceful woman he left at home wasn't just his wife. She was his greatest miscalculation, and she wasn't about to get even, she was about to get everything. The weight of the velvet box in Garrett Montgomery's inner jacket pocket was a familiar sensation. It was the specific gravity of a secret, dense and thrilling. He sat opposite Scarlett Laurent, at a secluded corner table, at per se the city lights of Columbus Circle, a glittering, out-of-focus backdrop to the real main event. Scarlett was 26 in age, that felt both impossibly young and dangerously ambitious. Her eyes, the color of warm honey, were fixed on him, reflecting the candlelight and a hunger he found intoxicating. "You've been quiet tonight, Garrett," she murmured, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. The wine was a 1998 Chateau Margaux, a bottle he'd had the sommelier retrieve from the restaurant's private cellar. It was a wine that cost more than most people's monthly rent, a casual display of the power he wielded. Garrett offered a practiced, charming smile, just admiring the view. He wasn't talking about the city. He was the CEO and founder of Apex Innovations, a tech behemoth he had built from the ground up. His face was a regular feature on the covers of Forbes and Wired. He was 48 years old, with a mane of silvering hair he kept impeccably styled, and the lean, predatory physique of a man who fought time with personal trainers and sheer force of will. He had everything, including a wife, Aurelia, who was, in his estimation, the perfect corporate spouse. She was beautiful, poised from old money, and completely uninterested in the brutal mechanics of his business world. She ran charities, hosted flawless dinner parties, and looked stunning on his arm. She was predictable, and for Garrett, predictability bred complacency. Scarlett was the antidote to that complacency. She was a fiery, unpredictable variable in the otherwise sterile equation of his life. "I have something for you," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He slid the box across the starched white linen. Scarlett's perfectly glossed lips parted in a silent gasp. She didn't open it immediately, instead, savoring the moment her eyes locked on his. She knew the game. This wasn't a gift of love. It was a transaction. It was a retainer for her time, her affection, her discretion. Garrett. She breathed, her fingers finally closing around the box. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of black satin, was the ring. It wasn't just a ring. It was a landmark. A flawless 12-carat cornflower blue sapphire, flanked by 2 pear-shaped diamonds. It was known as the Star of Jaipur, a legendary stone that had been auctioned at Sotheby's just last week, a piece once owned by Indian royalty. The news of its sale for a staggering $4.2 million had been a small item in the society pages. Tears welled in Scarlett's eyes. Genuine or not, it hardly mattered. They served their purpose. I don't know what to say. It's a piece of history. And now it's a piece of you, Garrett said, smoothly feeling the familiar surge of power that came with such a grand gesture. He was bestowing a fortune, a legend, upon this girl, binding her to him with its impossible value. He helped her slide it onto her finger. It looked magnificent, a beacon of impossible wealth. "Don't wear it everywhere," he cautioned. "It's a special occasion piece. Every moment with you is a special occasion," she purred, leaning across the table to kiss him, the cold stone of the ring pressing against his cheek. Later that night, As Garrett's driver navigated the quiet, tree-lined streets toward his Central Park West penthouse, he felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. He checked his reflection in the darkened window of the Maybach. He looked tired. He loosened his tie, the thrill of the evening already dissipating, replaced by a familiar hollowness. When he entered the sprawling apartment, the silence was absolute. The lights were dimmed, casting long shadows across the museum-quality art and minimalist furniture. Aurelia was in the library, bathed in the soft glow of a reading lamp. She was curled in a large armchair, a heavy-looking book in her lap. She looked up as he entered, her expression serene. Aurelia Dubois Montgomery was a woman of quiet, deliberate grace. Her beauty wasn't flashy like Scarlett's. It was timeless, sculpted from generations of wealth and breeding. Her dark hair was pulled back into a simple chignon, and she wore a simple silk robe. At 45, she seemed to exist outside the frantic grasp of time that so terrified Garrett. "You're late," she said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. Her voice was low and calm. Board dinner ran long. "You know how it is." The lie slipped out effortlessly, polished by years of practice. He leaned down to kiss her, but she subtly turned her head so his lips met her cheek. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it was a wall. He'd been feeling those walls go up more and more lately. How was the benefit planning, he asked, moving to the bar to pour himself a scotch. "Productive. We finalized the catering with Jean-Georges," she replied, her eyes not leaving her book. "Penelope Wright stopped by. Her firm is handling the auction contracts." Penelope was Aurelia's oldest friend and a partner at Sullivan and Cromwell, one of the most powerful law firms in the city. Garrett had always found her unnervingly sharp. Good. He mumbled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He looked at his wife, really looked at her for the first time, in what felt like months. He saw the elegant line of her neck, the intelligent set of her eyes. He had married her because she was the right choice, a strategic merger of his new money ambition with her old money prestige. He had never considered her a partner. She was a director on the board of a few museums, a philanthropist. He handled the real world, the world of hostile takeovers and stock options. She handled the world of floral arrangements and seating charts. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to confess, to tell her about the ring, about the hollowness, about everything. But the moment passed. It was easier to maintain the fiction. It was safer. "I'm heading to bed," he said, draining his glass. "Big day tomorrow. We're closing the Neuralink acquisition." "Of course," Aurelia said, finally looking up from her book. Her eyes were clear and steady, revealing nothing. "Sleep well, Garrett." He walked out of the library, leaving her in her pool of soft light. He was the king of his world, a master of the universe. He had just handed over a multi-million-dollar treasure to his mistress and lied to his wife's face without flinching. He felt no guilt. He felt nothing at all. And in that vast, empty feeling, he failed to notice the title of the book Aurelia was reading, The Art of War. Aurelia waited until the sound of the master bedroom door clicked shut, a definitive, solid sound that echoed the closing of a chapter. She sat motionless for a full 10 minutes, her senses attuned to the quiet hum of the penthouse. The only sound was the faint traffic noise from the streets below and the rhythmic beating of her own heart. She closed her book, marking her page, and set it deliberately on the side table. The war she was studying was not one of swords and shields, but of leverage and information. She walked not to her own bedroom, but down the long art-lined corridor to Garrett's private study. It was his sanctuary, a space of dark wood, leather, and technology that she rarely entered. The room smelled of his cologne and a faint, metallic scent of ambition. Her destination was a large, steel-grey safe concealed behind an abstract painting by Gerhard Richter. She knew the combination. It was the date their first and only child, a son, would have been born had he survived the pregnancy 20 years ago. The irony of Garrett using a date of shared tragedy to secure his private treasures was a cruelty so profound it had long ago ceased to sting, hardening instead into a cold, hard stone in her gut. Her fingers, steady and sure, turned the dial. A soft click and the heavy door swung open. Inside were neat stacks of bearer bonds, several high-end watches, in their cases property deeds and a collection of jewelry boxes. Most were from Graf Harry Winston Cartier, but her eyes went directly to the long, dark blue box from Sotheby's. It was exactly where she had seen it 2 weeks ago, when she'd retrieved her mother's pearls. She lifted the lid. The black satin interior was empty. The indentation where the star of Jaipur had rested was a perfect, sapphire-shaped void. It wasn't a shock. It was a confirmation. Aurelia felt no rage, no hot flash of betrayal. What she felt was a chilling, crystalline clarity, the kind that comes after a long fever has broken. For years she had lived in a state of willful ignorance, choosing to interpret the late nights, the sudden business trips, and the emotional distance as the necessary sacrifices for his monumental success. She had played her part, the supportive, unquestioning wife, because it was easier than confronting the truth. But the truth had now presented itself in the form of an empty box. This wasn't his first affair. She was not that naive. But this was different. The others had been fleeting, disposable distractions. This ring, this specific, historically significant, publicly auctioned ring. This was a statement. It was an act of breathtaking arrogance, a slap in the face delivered with a diamond-encrusted glove. He hadn't just cheated. He had liquidated a piece of their shared assets, a piece of her history to do it. The ring had been purchased through a family trust fund. Her father had established a trust, of which Garrett was the acting manager. It was legally and morally half hers. She closed the safe, spun the dial, and slid the Richter painting back into place, her movements fluid and silent. The next morning she met Penelope Wright at a quiet cafe on the Upper East Side, far from their usual haunts. Penelope, with her razor-sharp bob and eyes that missed nothing, listened intently as Aurelia recounted her discovery, her voice never rising above a calm, measured tone. "The Sotheby's auction," Penelope said, stirring her espresso. "I remember reading about it. The anonymous buyer. So it was him. He used the Dubois family trust to make the purchase Aurelia stated. The quarterly statement came yesterday. A single wire transfer to Sotheby's for $4 to $15,000, including the buyer's premium." Penelope's eyebrows shot up. "He used your family trust, Aurelia. That's not just marital infidelity. That's a flagrant breach of fiduciary duty. We can crucify him for that alone." "No," Aurelia said, her gaze firm. "A messy public divorce is what he expects. He'd throw money at it, drag me through the mud, paint me as a bitter, scorned wife. The tabloids like the New York Post would have a field day. He would control the narrative, and in the end, I'd walk away with a handsome settlement, and he'd continue on unblemished. I am not interested in a settlement, Penny. I'm interested in a reckoning." Penelope leaned back, a slow, admiring smile spreading across her face. She had known Aurelia since they were roommates at Vassar. She knew the brilliant strategic mind that Aurelia had deliberately kept hidden behind a facade of social grace. Aurelia's father, the late Jean-Paul Dubois, had been a titan of industry, a shrewd investor who had taught his daughter far more about balance sheets than flower arrangements. A reckoning. Penelope repeated the word, tasting like victory. "What did you have in mind? Apex Innovations is his identity, his lifeblood." His soul, Aurelia said, her voice dropping lower. He built it, and he believes it is an extension of himself. He's become arrogant, so convinced of his own genius that he's surrounded himself with sycophants. His board is packed with old friends who rubber-stamp his decisions. He's over-leveraged on the Neuralink acquisition. I've seen the financials he foolishly leaves on his desk. He thinks he's untouchable. She paused, taking a sip of her tea. I want to take it away from him. Penelope stared at her, the full, audacious scope of the plan dawning on her. This wasn't about divorce. This was about utter annihilation. Aurelia Apex is a public company, valued at over $20 billion. To take a controlling interest. My personal inheritance from my father, separate from the marital assets, and the trust Garrett controls is substantial. Aurelia interrupted calmly. The portfolio is managed by J.P. Morgan Private Bank. It's valued at just over $2.8 billion. It's been sitting there quietly growing for 20 years. Garrett knows it exists, but he's never known the specifics. He thinks of it as my rainy day fund. Penelope's legal mind was racing, connecting dots, seeing pathways. With that as collateral, we could secure a line of credit of 5, maybe 6 billion. We could set up a series of offshore shell corporations, begin acquiring shares on the open market. Slowly, quietly. He'll see the trading volume, but he'll never trace it back to you. Exactly, Aurelia said. He'll blame a hostile bid from a competitor, maybe Oracle or Salesforce. He'll look for enemies outside the gates, never once thinking to check the citadel itself. This is a declaration of war. Aurelia Penelope warned, her expression serious. Once we start, there is no turning back. It will be brutal. Aurelia looked out the window at the bustling Madison Avenue traffic. For 20 years she had been a silent partner. Her intelligence and insight dismissed her inheritance, treated as a quaint hobby. He had taken her for granted, and now he had taken from her. The era of the quiet, graceful Mrs. Montgomery was over. I know, she said, her voice like ice, and I have never been more ready. The annual conservation gala at the American Museum of Natural History was the glittering apex of the New York philanthropic season. It was Aurelia's territory, an event she had co-chaired for the past decade. Tonight, the vast Milstein Hall of Ocean Life was transformed with tables set up beneath the life-sized model of the blue whale. The air hummed with the sound of discreet gossip, clinking champagne flutes, and the quiet, ferocious networking of the city's elite. Aurelia was a vision in a custom Oscar de la Renta gown of deep sapphire blue, a color she had chosen with deliberate, painful irony. Diamonds dripped from her ears and circled her throat, her own diamonds from her mother's collection. She moved through the room with an effortless grace, a warm smile for a bank CEO here, a shared laugh with a senator's wife there. She was the perfect hostess, the picture of serene elegance. Garrett stood by her side, looking pleased with himself. He loved these events. They were a stage for him, a chance to be seen as not just a ruthless tech mogul, but a benevolent pillar of the community. He was basking in the glow, accepting compliments on Apex's soaring stock price, completely oblivious to the predator standing beside him in designer silk. "You've outdone yourself this year, darling," he murmured, squeezing her arm. "The place looks incredible." "I do my best," she replied, her smile never faltering, though his touch felt like a brand. Her eyes were scanning the room, not for donors, but for one specific guest. She knew Scarlett would be here. Garrett had secured her a ticket through a corporate sponsorship for a small, up-and-coming art gallery she nominally worked for. It was a classic move, hiding in plain sight. She spotted her near the bar, holding court with a group of younger tech investors. Scarlett was wearing a crimson dress that was cut daringly low, a stark and deliberate contrast to the old money conservatism that filled the room. She was a splash of new, loud color in a muted classic painting. And on the fourth finger of her left hand, catching the light from every angle, was the star of Jaipur. It was not a subtle piece of jewelry. On her hand, it was a declaration, a weapon. Aurelia watched as Scarlet began to move through the crowd, her path a calculated spiraling trajectory that was leading inevitably to them. Garrett saw her too. A flicker of panic crossed his face, quickly masked by a wooden smile. "Aurelia, let's go say hello to the Barclays," he said, trying to steer her away. In a moment, Garrett Aurelia, said, her voice soft but unyielding. She stood her ground, her gaze fixed on the approaching redhead. "I see someone I simply must greet." Scarlet arrived, her smile a mix of feigned innocence and pure triumph. "Garrett, and you must be Aurelia," she gushed, extending her hand. "I'm Scarlett Laurent. I've heard so much about you. It's an honor to finally meet you. This event is just breathtaking." Aurelia took her hand, her grip surprisingly firm. Her eyes met Scarlett's, and then traveled with theatrical slowness down to the magnificent ring. She held Scarlett's hand for a moment, longer than was comfortable, her thumb gently brushing against the massive sapphire. "Ms. Laurent Aurelia," said, her voice clear and carrying in the small space around them. "What an extraordinary piece of jewelry, a true connoisseur's item." Scarlett preened her plan, working to perfection. "Oh, thank you. It was a gift. From a very, very generous admirer." She glanced at Garrett, a sly, proprietary look in her eyes. Garrett's face was a mask of forced neutrality. He looked like a man standing on a landmine, afraid to move a single muscle. Several people nearby had begun to notice the quiet drama unfolding, their conversations trailing off. Aurelia finally released Scarlett's hand, but her eyes, cold and analytical, remained on the ring. "The Star of Jaipur. If I'm not mistaken," she continued, her tone as pleasant as if she were discussing the weather. "From the Maharaja of Patiala's collection. I followed the auction at Sotheby's with great interest. A fascinating piece. Its history is rather turbulent. It's said to bring great fortune to whoever possesses it, but terrible ruin to whoever steals it. Or I suppose to whoever receives it under false pretenses." The smile on Scarlett's face faltered. The air grew thick with unspoken meaning. Garrett's jaw was clenched so tight, a muscle ticked violently. Aurelia then turned her full attention to the younger woman, her smile becoming something sharp and almost pitying. "It's a magnificent stone. But you must be careful, dear. A ring of that size and significance requires a certain stature to wear. On the wrong hand, it can look less like a gift and more like a transaction, almost vulgar." The word hung in the air, a perfectly delivered stiletto. Scarlett's face, which had been flushed with triumph, turned pale with humiliation. The onlookers quickly averted their eyes, pretending to be engrossed in their canapes. Without another glance at Scarlett, Aurelia turned to her husband. "Garrett, darling, you promised me a dance." She looped her arm through his and gently pulled him toward the dance floor, leaving a stunned Scarlett standing alone, the multi-million-dollar ring on her finger, suddenly feeling as heavy and as cheap as a piece of glass. As they swayed to the music, Garrett's grip on her was painfully tight. What the hell was that? He hissed, his voice a furious whisper. "You were trying to embarrass me." Aurelia leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice a placid murmur against his ear. "Was I was simply making conversation. I thought you'd be proud. You always said you wanted me to take more of an interest in your acquisitions." He pulled back, searching her face for any sign of anger, of tears, of the hysterics he had prepared himself to handle. But he found nothing. Her expression was perfectly, terrifyingly serene. It was like looking into the calm, placid blue of a lake and knowing that just beneath the surface the depths were icy cold and infinitely deep. He had come tonight, expecting to manage a potentially awkward situation. He realized now, with a dawning sense of dread, he couldn't comprehend that he had not been managing anything. He had just walked blind and smiling straight into the opening salvo of a war he didn't even know had been declared. The Monday after the gala, the silent war began. In a nondescript office in the Cayman Islands, a newly formed entity named Athena Holdings executed its first buy order for 50,000 shares of Apex Innovations. The transaction was a drop in the ocean, completely unnoticed by the market. The next day, another entity, Nemesis Capital, registered in Delaware, bought 75,000 shares. Over the next 3 months, this pattern continued with relentless, ghost-like precision. A network of 12 shell corporations, managed by Penelope Wright's most discreet associates and funded by Aurelia's J.P. Morgan credit line, began to systematically absorb Apex stock. They bought in small, irregular blocks at different times of day, through various brokers, creating a trading pattern so diffuse and chaotic it was almost impossible to trace back to a single source. It was a masterpiece of financial camouflage. Aurelia, meanwhile, played her part to perfection. She continued her life as Mrs. Montgomery, with a placid, almost beatific calm. She attended her charity board meetings, oversaw the redecoration of their Hamptons estate, and hosted a dinner party for the French ambassador. To Garrett, her behavior after the gala was baffling. He had expected an explosion, a confrontation. Instead, he got nothing. A polite, distant coolness had settled between them, a chasm of unspoken words he was too arrogant and too cowardly to cross. He wrote it off as a prolonged sulk, a feminine Cold War he could wait out. His focus was on his company. Strange things were happening at Apex. The trading volume is up 18% over the 90-day average, but the price is barely moving, said David Chen, Garrett's CFO, pointing at a complex chart on the large screen in Garrett's office. It's death by 1,000 cuts. Someone is accumulating a massive position, but they're being incredibly careful not to spook the market and drive up the price. Garrett stared at the data, a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. It's got to be a competitor. Ellison over at Oracle, maybe, or Benioff at Salesforce. They'd love to get their hands on our AI patents. We've had our people at Goldman Sachs run the analysis, David said, adjusting his glasses. They can't find a trail. The buy orders are coming from everywhere and nowhere. It's the most sophisticated stealth accumulation they've ever seen. Whoever this is, they're not just rich. They're brilliant. Garrett slammed his fist on his mahogany desk. Brilliant and gutless. Why not just launch a tender offer? Make a real play for the company instead of skulking in the shadows. He was agitated, paranoid. He started seeing threats everywhere. He snapped at his assistants, questioned the loyalty of his board members, and spent sleepless nights staring at stock tickers. The Neuralink acquisition, which should have been his crowning achievement, had stretched the company's finances thin, making it vulnerable. The debt they had taken on was substantial. A sudden dip in stock price or a hostile takeover bid now would be catastrophic. The pressure was also affecting his relationship with Scarlett. Their clandestine meetings became less about passion and more about his frantic, obsessive monologues about market fluctuations and corporate espionage. "I just don't understand why you're so worried," Scarlett said one afternoon in the sterile, modern hotel suite Garrett kept for their trysts. She was examining her reflection, admiring the star of Jaipur on her finger. "You're Garrett Montgomery. You'll crush them." "It's not that simple, Scarlett," he snapped, pacing the room. "This isn't a street fight. It's a chess game, and my opponent is a ghost." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, her youth and lack of sophistication grated on him. She couldn't grasp the scale of the threat he was facing. Her world was a simple one of gifts and admiration. His was a complex, brutal ecosystem of power and capital. They were speaking different languages. The thrill was gone, replaced by a growing irritation. Meanwhile, in her quiet library overlooking Central Park, Aurelia was playing the game with the precision of a grandmaster. Every evening, Penelope would send over an encrypted file containing the day's acquisitions and a market analysis from a team of ex-McKinsey consultants she had hired. Aurelia studied the reports, cross-referencing them with the Apex quarterly earnings reports and shareholder documents Garrett left lying around his study. She learned the rhythms of her husband's company, its strengths, its vulnerabilities. She knew which board members were loyalists and which ones were merely opportunistic. She knew where the financial weak points were, the divisions that were underperforming, the vanity projects that were draining resources. "We're at 4.7%, Penelope reported during one of their secure video calls. "Once we cross the 5% threshold, we'll be legally required to file a 13D with the SEC. That's when the ghost shows its face. "Not yet," Aurelia said. "Garrett holds 22% of the company. The board and loyal executives hold another 15%. The rest is held by institutional investors and the public. He feels secure in his 37% controlling block. He won't see the threat until it's at his throat. We need to move faster. Aurelia, to accelerate, we'd need more capital. A lot more." Aurelia paused, her gaze distant. "My father owned a vineyard in Bordeaux Chateau Dubois-la-Fleur. It wasn't part of the trust. He left it to me in a separate will, my personal property. It's valued at a significant amount." Penelope was stunned. "You're going to sell the Chateau Aurelia that's been in your family for over 200 years. Aurelia thought of the generations of Dubois who had walked those vineyards. Then she thought of Garrett, of his casual cruelty of the empty box in the safe. A 200-year-old legacy for a 20-year marriage. It seemed like a fair trade. "Some roots need to be cut to allow for new growth," Aurelia said, her voice devoid of sentiment. "Sell it, Penelope. Liquidate it all. We're going to end this." As the deal to sell the French vineyard was quietly brokered in Paris, Garrett in New York was becoming increasingly unhinged. He called an emergency meeting with his executive team. "I want a poison pill provision drafted immediately," he commanded, his voice raw. "A shareholder rights plan. If any single entity acquires more than 10% of our stock without board approval, it triggers a massive dilution of their shares. We make a takeover prohibitively expensive." David Chen hesitated. "Garrett, the board will be hesitant to approve that. It's a drastic measure, it screams desperation to the market. It will tank our stock price." "I don't care," Garrett roared, his face red. "I will not lose my company to some faceless hedge fund coward. He was building fortifications, laying traps, and preparing for a siege. He was a king in his castle, watching the horizon for an invading army. He never once thought to check the Queen's chambers where the maps were being redrawn, and the entire kingdom was being sold silently and invisibly from right under his feet." The day the 13D filing hit the SEC was a Tuesday. The document was an earthquake. It revealed that a single previously unknown investment vehicle, Athena Holdings, had acquired 8.9% of Apex Innovations. Wall Street was electrified. The ghost finally had a name, but no face. Financial journalists at Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal scrambled, but the holding company was a black box, its origins obscured by layers of Cayman Islands corporate law. Garrett was apoplectic. "Athena Holdings. Who the hell are they? I want a name. I want a face," He bellowed into his phone at his legal team. But 2 days later, a second filing dropped. Nemesis Capital revealed a 7.5% stake, then a third, a fourth, and a fifth, all within the span of a week. It was a coordinated multi-front assault. In total, a consortium of seemingly unrelated entities now owned a combined 40% of Apex Innovations. They had bypassed his 10% poison pill trigger by acting as separate entities, a legal grey area so brilliantly exploited that his lawyers were left stammering. The market, finally understanding that this was a serious hostile takeover, went into a frenzy. The stock price surged. The consortium, having already acquired its position at a lower cost, had made a paper fortune in a matter of days. The final move came via a terse, formal letter from Penelope Wright's firm, Sullivan and Cromwell, acting on behalf of the consortium. It called for an emergency meeting of the board of directors to discuss the new controlling shareholder structure and the future strategic direction of the company. Garrett spent the 48 hours leading up to the meeting in a state of furious, sleepless paranoia. He met with his loyal board members, trying to shore up his support. His 37% block, which had once seemed an insurmountable fortress, was now a minority position. The consortium held 41%. The remaining 22% was held by institutional investors and swing voters on the board who were notoriously unsentimental. They would back whichever side promised them the greatest return. Garrett was a fighter. He prepared for the fight of his life. He had his team assemble a presentation showcasing his vision for the company, highlighting record profits and the potential of the Neuralink acquisition. He would appeal to the board's greed and their fear of the unknown. He would paint the consortium as corporate raiders, asset strippers, who would dismantle the company he had built. He would walk into that boardroom and tear them to shreds. The morning of the meeting, he dressed in his most powerful suit, a dark charcoal brioni, and a blood-red tie. As he was about to leave the penthouse, Aurelia emerged from her bedroom. She too was dressed for business. She was wearing a severe, exquisitely tailored black pantsuit. From the row, her hair pulled back in a tight, commanding chignon. A single strand of pearls was her only adornment. She looked less like a philanthropist and more like a CEO. "Where are you going dressed like that?" he asked, distracted. "I have a board meeting," she replied, her voice cool and even. She picked up a slim leather briefcase from the hall table. "The museum." "Something like that," she said. She looked him directly in the eye. "Good luck today, Garrett. I have a feeling you're going to need it." There was something in her tone, a finality, a hint of steel that he was too preoccupied to decipher. He brushed it off and headed downtown. When Garrett strode into the Apex boardroom on the 80th floor, his loyalists were already assembled, their faces grim. The air was thick with tension. He took his place at the head of the long mahogany table, his chair positioned before a panoramic window that offered a godlike view of the city he had conquered. "Let's get this over with," he growled. "Let's see what these pirates have to say for themselves." At precisely 10:00 a.m., the boardroom doors opened. In walked Penelope Wright, her face an unreadable mask of professional calm. And behind her, walking with a steady, unhurried gait that commanded the attention of every person in the room, was Aurelia. A stunned, disbelieving silence fell over the boardroom. The board members exchanged confused glances. Garrett stared, his mouth agape, as his wife took a seat on the opposite side of the table, placing her leather briefcase before her with a soft, definitive click. "Aurelia, what in God's name are you doing here?" Garrett finally sputtered, his voice a mixture of confusion and rage. "This is a closed board meeting. Get out." Aurelia didn't even look at him. Her attention was on the chairman of the board, a man named Robert Meacham. Penelope Wright spoke, her voice cutting through the tension. "Gentlemen, I am Penelope Wright from Sullivan and Cromwell. I am here today as legal counsel for Athena Holdings Nemesis Capital and their associated entities, which, as of this morning, collectively represent a 50% controlling interest in Apex Innovations. She paused, letting the number sink in. 51%. They had acquired another 10% in the last few days of frantic trading. It was a definitive, unassailable majority. These entities, Penelope continued, are all wholly owned subsidiaries of a single private family trust. The sole trustee and beneficiary of that trust is my client. She gestured cleanly toward the woman sitting beside her. Mrs. Aurelia Dubois Montgomery. The color drained from Garrett's face. He looked as if he had been physically struck. He swiveled his chair to face Aurelia, his eyes wide with a horror that was slowly curdling into understanding. The gala, the coldness, her board meeting. It all clicked into place in one sickening moment of revelation. "You," he whispered, the sound barely audible. "You did this?" Aurelia finally met his gaze. Her eyes were not filled with anger or triumph. They were cold, clear, and utterly devoid of emotion. They were the eyes of a stranger. As the representative of the new majority shareholder, Aurelia said, her voice steady and ringing with an authority no one in that room had ever heard from her before. "My first action is to call a vote. A vote on the immediate removal of Garrett Montgomery as chairman and chief executive officer of Apex Innovations for cause citing gross mismanagement and breach of fiduciary duty." She opened her briefcase and slid a thick, bound document across the polished table toward the chairman. "You'll find a detailed account of Mr. Montgomery's use of company funds and marital assets for non-corporate purposes, including the purchase of significant unapproved gifts. A copy of the Sotheby's receipt for the Star of Jaipur is on page 3. Garrett was speechless. He was suffocating. His throne was tilting on its axis. He looked around at the faces of the board members. He saw no loyalty there now. He saw only the cold, hard calculation of men shifting their allegiance to the new center of power. They were looking at Aurelia. Robert Measham cleared his throat, avoiding Garrett's pleading gaze. "A motion has been made by the majority shareholder. Do I have a second?" A hand went up. Then another, and another. Garrett Montgomery, the titan of tech, the master of the universe, sat in his chair, utterly defeated, as he was clinically and efficiently erased from the company that he had once considered his soul. His executioner was the one person in the world he had never not for a single second considered a threat. His wife. The drive back to the penthouse was a silent, suffocating ordeal. Garrett sat in the back of the Maybach, staring blankly at the city rushing past. The world outside the car was the same, but his place in it had been fundamentally and irrevocably altered. He was no longer Garrett Montgomery, CEO of Apex. He was just Garrett Montgomery. The name felt hollow, stripped of its power. Aurelia sat opposite him, her posture perfect. Her gaze directed out her own window. She hadn't said a word since the vote. She hadn't needed to. When the elevator doors opened directly into their apartment, Garrett stormed out, his shock finally erupting into a tidal wave of rage. He whirled on her as she calmly stepped into the foyer. "How could you?" He roared, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "My own wife. You conspired behind my back. You schemed, you plotted to destroy me. For 20 years, Aurelia, 20 years of marriage. Was it all a lie?" Aurelia set her briefcase down on a marble console table. She took off her jacket, draping it neatly over a chair. She was in no hurry. She was in complete control. A lie, she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. She turned to face him, and for the first time, The mask of calm cracked, revealing the raw, wounded fury that had been simmering for years. You want to talk about lies, Garrett? Do you want to talk about the bored dinners that ended at dawn, the business trips to St. Bart's with your executive assistant? Do you want to talk about looking me in the eye and telling me you loved me after you'd just spent the afternoon in a hotel suite with a girl young enough to be your daughter? He was taken aback by her ferocity. This was not the passive, placid Aurelia he knew. "That has nothing to do with my company," he shot back, his voice cracking. "That was personal. This is business. You've stolen my life's work. Your life's work." She laughed, a bitter, startling sound. "You built Apex with seed money from my father's estate. You leveraged my family's name and connections to get your first meetings at Goldman Sachs. You secured the patents for your initial algorithm by acquiring a small firm owned by a friend of my father's. Apex wasn't just your life's work, Garrett. It was built on the foundation of my life, my family, my inheritance. I was a silent, uncredited partner from the very beginning. You just never bothered to notice. Every word was a perfectly aimed blow, dismantling the myth of the self-made man he had so carefully constructed. And then she continued, her voice dropping, becoming laced with a pain so deep it was terrifying. You took money from a trust established by my father, a trust that contained my history, my security, and you used it to buy a trinket. A multi-million-dollar bribe for your mistress. You didn't just betray me as a wife, Garrett. You stole from me as a business partner. And that, she said, taking a step closer, her eyes blazing, was a fatal business mistake. He was deflated, the rage draining out of him, replaced by a desperate, pathetic pleading. "Aurelia, please. We can fix this. I'll end it with Scarlett. I'll do anything. Don't do this. Don't take my company. It's not your company anymore." She stated the finality of the words like a death sentence. "And you are mistaken about what this is. This is not a negotiation. This is an accounting for 20 years of being underestimated, for 20 years of being a decorative object, for 20 years of being patted on the head and told not to worry my pretty little head about real work. The accounting is now complete. The debt has been paid." She walked past him, heading toward the master suite. "My lawyers have already filed for divorce. They will be in touch with yours. I will be staying in the penthouse. You, I believe, still have the key to your hotel suite. I suggest you use it." The fallout for Scarlett Laurent was swift and brutal. The day after the board meeting, her phone lit up with calls from Garrett. She ignored them. She was no fool. She read the news alerts from the Wall Street Journal. Garrett Montgomery ousted from Apex in shocking boardroom coup, led by wife Aurelia Montgomery. She knew instantly that her meal ticket had expired. Garrett was no longer a king. He was a liability. Her brief, glorious flight into the stratosphere of New York society was over. Her only remaining asset was the star of Jaipur. She took it to a private jeweler on 47th Street, a man known for his discretion. She needed to liquidate it fast. She imagined the millions of dollars she would get enough to set her up for life, a handsome severance package for her services. The jeweler examined the ring under a loupe, his face grim. "The stone is magnificent," he said. "But there is a problem." What problem? Scarlett asked, her heart beginning to pound. "I made some calls. It seems Sullivan and Cromwell, on behalf of the Dubois Family Trust, has placed a lien on the stone. They have filed a legal claim stating it is stolen property purchased with misappropriated funds. No reputable dealer in the world will touch it. It's a 12-carat, $4 million paperweight. In fact, possessing it could make you an accessory to a crime." Scarlett stared at him, the blood draining from her face. The ring, her symbol of triumph, was now a trap. Aurelia hadn't just disarmed her, she had turned her own weapon against her. Scarlet was left with nothing but a worthless, beautiful rock and the bitter taste of being a pawn in a game far more complex than she had ever imagined. She had flown close to the sun, and her wings, it turned out, were made of nothing more than glass. The first 100 days of Aurelia Montgomery's tenure as CEO of Apex Innovations were a masterclass in corporate leadership. The business world, which had initially viewed the takeover as a sensational, tabloid-worthy divorce drama, was forced to sit up and take notice. Aurelia was not a vengeful amateur. She was a visionary. She began not with sweeping changes, but with listening. She met with division heads, engineers, marketers, and even the interns. She walked the floors of the company headquarters, asking questions and absorbing information with an intensity that stunned employees who were used to Garrett's top-down authoritarian style. Her first major executive decision was to promote David Chen to Chief Operating Officer. He had been loyal to Garrett, but he was more importantly loyal to the company. Aurelia recognized his talent and his integrity. Her second move was to announce a complete strategic review of the company, led by the prestigious consulting firm McKinsey & Company. She ruthlessly cut Garrett's vanity projects, saving the company hundreds of millions of dollars. She renegotiated the terms of the Neuralink acquisition debt, using her old family connections at JP Morgan to secure a more favorable interest rate. She took the capital saved and reinvested it directly into research and development, the true engine of the tech company, which Garrett had been starving in favor of flashier short-term gains. She rebranded. Apex Innovations under her leadership would not just be about profit, but about purpose. She established the Apex Foundation, seeding it with $100 million of her own money to promote STEM education for young women. It wasn't just good philanthropy, it was brilliant PR and a long-term investment in their future talent pool. The market responded. After an initial period of volatility, Apex stock began to climb steadily and surely. It surpassed its previous highs under Garrett's leadership. Aurelia proved to be a natural on quarterly earnings calls, her calm, data-driven, and no-nonsense approach inspiring confidence in a way Garrett's bluster never could. She didn't charm the analysts. She convinced them with cold, hard facts. 6 months after the takeover, she sat in her office, Garrett's old office on the 80th floor. She had redecorated. The dark, masculine wood and leather were gone, replaced with a light, airy design, modern art and orchids. The room was no longer a monument to a single ego, but a functional, beautiful space for work. She was looking over a proposal for a new partnership with the Kering Group, integrating Apex's AI technology into their luxury retail experience. It was a deal Garrett had tried and failed to land for years. Aurelia had secured a meeting with François-Henri Pinault himself. Her phone buzzed. It was a notification from Google Alerts, a small article in Vanity Fair's online society column. It was a brief mention of Garrett Montgomery, spotted at a bar in Miami looking gaunt and a shadow of his former self. The divorce had been finalized, leaving him with a fraction of the fortune he once commanded. He was a man untethered from the source of his power and identity, adrift in a world that no longer revered him. Aurelia read the sentence and felt a surprising lack of emotion. There was no joy, no schadenfreude, no lingering anger. There was only a quiet sense of closure, the feeling of closing a long, difficult book and placing it back on the shelf. His story was over. Hers was just beginning. She put the phone down and turned back to the window. The panoramic view of the city, once Garrett's symbol of conquest, was now hers. But she saw it differently. He had seen a kingdom to be ruled. She saw a network of possibilities, a landscape of connections, a future to be built. The power she held was not the power of possession, but the power of creation. She had not stolen his company. She had liberated it. And in doing so, she had finally completely liberated herself. Aurelia Montgomery's story is a chilling reminder that the most dangerous opponent is the one you never see as a competitor. It's a tale not just of revenge, but of reclamation of a woman taking back the power, the credit and the future that was quietly stolen from her over 2 decades. She didn't just break out of her gilded cage. She dismantled it, sold it for parts, and used the profits to build an empire. It forces us to ask what happens when quiet strength decides to stop being quiet. And in a world of high-stakes business and personal betrayal, what would you have done? Would you have walked away with a settlement? Or would you have demanded the entire company as payment?
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.